So that's funeral directing in the ancient world. Now let's talk about religious beliefs concerning the dead. And this begins with what happens to your dead soul on your way to the underworld if you are not a member of the Orphic cult. Hermes was the god of messengers, of thieves, of roadways, and also he was the god who took your soul to the underworld. So he's like the tour guide of the dead. The fancier word for that is psychopompus, which I think is a ludicrous word, but that's the word for it in Greek. Psycho means soul, and pompos means a parade or a procession. If you've ever wondered why Pomp and Circumstance is called Pomp and Circumstance, that song they play at graduation, it's that root. So this is Hermes, the parade leader of the souls. And when he's doing this job, he carries a specific stick. This is the caduceus, which is what he's got in his hand here. It's a stick, and on the very top end of it are two snakes kind of twined around each other. Sometimes the two snakes will be twined around the entire stick. There's some variations on this. The number of snakes is really important. 2 snakes is Hermes caduceus that takes the souls of the dead to the underworld. 1 snake, that's doctors. So physicians, 1 snake. Dead souls, 2 snakes. Somebody try telling the AMA that. He has wings on his boots because he goes really, really fast. So that's kind of his thing. So when you see a picture of an ancient god, sometimes here it's not on his head, but there's this kind of round hat. That's a sun hat. So when he's doing this, he wears a sun hat. He's got his special caduceus. And then this is even more specific because it's on a lekythos, right? This perfume bottle used in funeral rites. That's who you're looking at. Death was associated very strongly in Greek thought with marriage. Specifically, though, marriage from the point of view of the bride, not the groom. So this is a culture where certainly we do see partnerships outside of marriage, both among same gender and different gender couples. But in terms of legally recognized marriage, it's a very binary one man, one woman kind of deal for ancient Greek people. And in the Greek-speaking world particularly, women were much younger than their husbands when they got married. So you'd have a 30 to 40-year-old husband marrying 13, 14, sometimes younger wife. And the way the ceremony worked is that he'd make a deal with your father, who would agree that you, the bride, would be married. And then your new husband would show up at your house, pick you up, take you to his family's house, and then bring you into the house, and then you'd now be a wife. You'd cease to be a young woman. More about that in the gender lecture. And then you'd have this whole new life as the mistress of this new house, theoretically. But your mother-in-law would be there too. My mother-in-law is a lovely lady, but we can't live together. All right. So here we see Hermes. Here is a woman wearing a full-body veil that somehow is not covering anything, but there she is. And she's got a crown on, as does her new spouse here. That is the god Hades. That's the goddess Persephone, and he's picking her up with the help of Hermes. Why is Hermes there, you may ask? Here is where the death thing comes in. The myth of Hades and Persephone was thought to be a metaphor for what death is like. So from Persephone's point of view, her father, Zeus, who is also Hades' brother, which is icky, but Greek gods, and Zeus is icky, and Hades here is, even in cultural context, he behaves a little ickily. he makes a deal with her father, but she doesn't know about it, her mom doesn't know about it, and he just shows up, picks her up with his chariot, and drags her into the underworld. She doesn't have a chance to say goodbye to her friends, she can't see her mom doesn't know what's going on. It's super traumatic. And then she's trapped in the underworld, and she's just stuck there with this guy she doesn't know, which is traumatic and creepy. But for ancient Greeks, the creepiness and the trauma was part of the point, because this isn't supposed to be a model of the ideal marriage. Although certain modern myth tellers do use this and kind of change the details to make it romantic, and there's a lot of debate back and forth about whether that's appropriate or not. But it's something that was happening in the ancient world too, where there was back and forth about the degree of consent Persephone gives to this and how on board she is. And I'm not going to unpack that too much. That's more for Finn's myth class. But suffice to say, something that doesn't change in the myth, because the myth is about death, is that Persephone is caught off guard, she's kidnapped, she's pretty upset at the beginning, and whether or not Hades obtained consent before it turns into a proper marriage or not, and that's the fuzzy thing in antiquity. I tend to be of the school of thought that the lack of consent is part of the point, because again, this is about death. Death takes you without full consent. You don't know where you're going. It's dissociating. It's irrevocable. You don't see people you know. You're in this other existence, and it is frightening to contemplate. So from Persephone's point of view then, this marriage was like a death. And Greek marriage to a lot of real breathing Greek women was also like a death. Like, when you're 14, even if you're in on the process of your father arranging your marriage to a 40-year-old dude, even by ancient standards, this isn't felt to be a consenty thing that she's going to be super happy about. Now, what ends up happening in the ancient world is this normalizes trauma, and that's really depressing. But back to the death thing. One of the things I find interesting about this myth is that it focuses relentlessly on Persephone's point of view, because in death we are all Persephone. We're all being kidnapped, we're being taken into something unknown, something that might have a lot of potential in it, something we may have prepared for, but can you really prepare for being dead? Now, in Persephone's case, because she's divine, she ends up, rather not she, her mother ends up negotiating a settlement where Persephone does get to come back and see her friends and then travel back and forth from the underworld to the upper world and back and forth again. This is also a metaphor for the agricultural year in ancient Greece. So this is meant to be kind of a hopeful story with ancient Greek logic. It's traumatic for Persephone in a way that, in the logic of this myth, is unavoidable. That's still quite depressing, isn't it? But Persephone is necessary to the functioning of the underworld, because a household wasn't a legal household in ancient Greece unless it was a household with a husband and wife. A husband alone wasn't expected to run the inside of the household. The wife was expected to do the budget, figure out the groceries, manage everybody who lived there, make the rules under the roof. Within her household, an ancient Greek woman was queen, and her husband, when he, if all went well and you didn't die in childbirth, generally speaking, he would die before you did, you were still in charge of that house. Young women certainly weren't given a ton of agency in ancient Greece, so there is something in here for Persephone, and that's part of what this myth is trying to convey, is that death is horrifying, death is traumatic, but death isn't the end. either of Persephone's story or ours, that Persephone and her family can still do things to make things better for her, that Persephone does have a future, she has agency, so it's not all a bad news myth. But this also tells you a lot about how ancient people are defaulting when they're thinking about their own death and coping with what that means for them. So we're going to look at some practical examples and then I'll leave y'all. This is the Amphipolis tomb. If you Google it, you can find more. I've put in a video on the YouTube channel that it gives you an animated tour where it takes you in through the front and down in through the chambers. And that shows this off a lot better than these images. These are just here for reference. So this was a super duper fancy Macedonian tomb that was found, it's almost been a decade, hasn't it? It's been a minute. But it's a pretty recent discovery, and everything about this tomb encapsulates the things we've been talking about with Greek beliefs about death and ritual. It's got many chambers, a lot like mystery religions had many stages of initiation. It goes from above to below. This is typical of anything having to do with the underworld in antiquity. When you're praying to gods who live on Olympus, you pray in temples where the steps go upwards. When you're praying to the gods of the underworld and the souls of the dead, you go downwards. So this tomb, it's built on a hill, so it's a little bit like a mountain, but the entrance here goes downwards because down is where the souls of the dead are, and down is where you pray when you're trying to contact them. And there's a lot of slippage between souls of the dead and gods because lots of people live in the underworld. Hades, Persephone, some gods hang out there part-time, Castor and Pollux are there part-time. You have a lot of what are called chthonic gods, so gods whose primary zip code is the underworld, including Hecate. She's a goddess of personal dilemmas and solving difficult to solve problems. More about her in a bit. She's also a goddess strongly connected to women's bodies and biological lifestyles. Here I'm using women as a shorthand for folks with an XX norm body with a uterus and everything that comes with it. In the front of the tomb, you have an entrance with a pair of sphinxes. The heads have broken off, but the heads would have been facing forward. Inside the next chamber, you have two female figures, each of them holding a torch. Torches are also a theme in the underworld because it's dark, because it's underground. And then deeper in, you have artwork, including a portrayal of the wedding of Hades and Persephone. We find tons of fan art of Hades and Persephone's wedding in tombs because that's the myth that encapsulates the moment of initial burial trauma. So that's what people are looking at as they're burying their wealthy dead is, okay, it's death, but it's also a wedding. Whatever gets you through. And then at the very end is where the bodies were buried, and it's bodies plural. I think there's one little kid, 2 women, and 2 men in this tomb, if I remember correctly. Yeah. One last thing to say about this, and that is katabatic rites. So this is a word that comes up in Ogden. Katabatic is from the Greek word katabino. Kata is down, like a catastrophe is where everything just goes downhill. Ba is from their word for to walk. So a katabatic rite is a walking down rite. And this is a rite that pulls on this idea of journeys to the underworld, that you can go down into the underworld and you can learn things and then you can come back up again. It's like the going down part is the easy part. We all do that. But coming back from the underworld with new knowledge, that is a really big part of Greek mythology and also a big part of myth making for Greek people associated with magic, particularly Greek dudes. So this is something that's part of Pythagoras, and Pythagoras debunkers like to lean into this a bit. But it's also something that comes out of this religious belief system in which heroes prove their heroism by going to the underworld to do stuff. Like Heracles or Hercules goes to the underworld to borrow Hades' puppy Cerberus for a while. Oh, who else? Let's see. Orpheus goes to the underworld, of course. Aeneas goes to the underworld at one point. After a while, it becomes standard. If you don't go to the underworld, are you even a hero? Odysseus does it. It's a whole thing. And this feature of myth is something that you see a lot of ancient, either magic workers or cult leaders, depending on how you think of them, positioning themselves as special people with special religious knowledge. So when folks like allegedly Pythagoras are crawling into holes and learning things, that is meaningful to the audience because of religious beliefs like this. And that's what a katabatic rite is. But there were also normal katabatic rites where you would make offerings to the dead, the gods of the underworld. In general, you use katabatic rites to refer to anything where you're trying to contact people who live in the underworld zip code. So if you're wondering what that word's for, that's it. And with that thought, I leave you down in the depths of this lecture, where we will come back again to talk about gender and women as they relate to Greek religious and magical belief. So, peace out. See you next time.